Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the basics. In our last video, we discussed correlation and causation. In this video, we're going to discuss ethics, utilitarianism. When philosophers study ethics, many philosophers will appeal to an ethical theory. An ethical theory is when we use a model, similar to in science, to come to a decision on what is the morally right thing to do. As with other theories, we want to be consistent. The ethical theory that we'll be discussing today is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the ethical theory of maximizing utility. In our next slides, we'll go over what counts as utility. But what we're doing here is trying to get the best situation out of something. So this is a form of another ethical theory, or a version of an ethical theory called consequentialism. And so what we're trying to do is get the best consequences out of an action, and that is the morally correct one. In utilitarianism, the best consequences are the ones that maximizes the most utility. So, in short, utilitarianism is the ethical theory where the action that maximizes utility is the morally correct action. So, if we are going to accept utilitarianism as the correct ethical theory, the logical form of an argument using utilitarianism would be as follows. A maximizes more utility than B. I should always do what maximizes the most utility. Therefore, I should do A. So not all utilitarians agree on what counts as utility. Today I'll be covering two traditional philosophers who are utilitarians, and anyone who studies philosophical ethics, especially utilitarianism, will need to know these two views. The first one comes from Jeremy Bentham. His view was maximizing happiness. Happiness is the utility that we should be trying to achieve. And his understanding of happiness was the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. So if you have more pleasure and less pain, that's happiness. A side note, he didn't rank any levels of happiness and pleasure against one another. He's famous for saying that pushpin is as good as poetry, to infer that you can't say one kind of pleasure is better than the other. Pleasure is pleasure. And an additional side note, Bentham also believed that every individual person's pleasure was equal to one another. You couldn't say, well, this person's pleasure is valued more than the other person's pleasure. All pleasure is equal. So John Stuart Mill, his father was a big fan of Jeremy Bentham. But John Stuart Mill had different views regarding pleasure. He disagreed that all pleasures were equal. He believed in higher order pleasures and lower order pleasures. So in Mill's utilitarianism, if you were in a dilemma on what kind of pleasure you were going to allow one person to have over somebody else, you would need to decide which pleasure was more of a higher order pleasure. Lower order pleasures would be the basic pleasures according to Mill, things like food and sex and stuff like that, those basic driving pleasures. And then the higher order pleasures according to Mill would be more your, gaining knowledge and reading really good books, and in his, going to the opera. So a lot of people would accuse Mill of being a bit of a snob here, but his overall idea was to have those higher order pleasures in the long run would be more pleasurable than those immediate basic pleasures. His view would be if you tried to maximize all those lower pleasures, you wouldn't get, the overall satisfying pleasures in the long run. If you want more information, you can go onto the website philosophycriticalthinking.com, and if you can purchase the book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy by Bernard Williams. I would recommend probably start reading that after we've covered all our topics regarding ethics. It is a hard read. It's not a clear read, but I think in the long run it's very valuable if you are interested in ethics and philosophy. In our next video, we're going to be moving on to the next form of ethical theory, which is categorical imperatives. If you want to stay in tune for that, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.